Right, thank you all for joining us for the second session of the afternoon. I think we only lost one or two people, and they probably will join us in a minute, which is always a good sign that we're doing the right thing here. So, thank you very much. The second session is entitled The Challenges and Implications of the Military Option. And we'll just follow the order of the presentations. We will start with David Dunn from POLSIS. We'll talk about the military strategic dimension of this subject.
Let's start off by thanking Asaf for his idea it was for this session. What's the problem? Israel has a bomb, India has a bomb, Pakistan has a bomb, why not Iran? Well, part of that answer to the question is the context. Scott just gave us context in the Iranian domestic sense. What I want to talk about here is the context in Iran's relationship with the wider world and with America in particular. Since 1979, Iran has been seen as one of the biggest problems of American foreign policy, seen as a challenge to America's regional dominance in the Middle East, seen as a threat to regional stability, seen as a threat to the Sunni regimes in Saudi Arabia and the rest of the Gulf, seen as an exporter of radical Islamicism, a threat to global oil supplies, hence its threat to attack shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, a threat to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, a threat to American credibility and its deterrent, a threat to provoke a regional arms race in the Middle East if they should get a bomb. The US fears not dealing with a unitary actor. It's difficult to deal with this country. It's not dealing necessarily with a rational actor in many of the US commentaries. America's policy towards the Middle East has really been shaped largely by the interaction of Iran and Iraq, and indeed the Iraq War of 2003 was partly justified in Washington by considerations to do with Iran. And of course, since 2003, and indeed before that, Iran and the West, or Iran and America, have been more or less in an undeclared state of low-level warfare in the way in which they have interacted in the region. And especially talking to the American military guys, actually, about their engagement with things from Iran, that becomes very evident. The activity comes in a variety of forms. The insurgency in Iraq and Afghanistan were as bloody as they were as a consequence of Iran, through the Quad forces, training, supplying, equipping and refining weaponry used by the insurgents in both those countries. Of course, as far as America is concerned, Iran is the #1 supporter of state sponsor of terrorism. In Hamas in Palestine, Hezbollah in Lebanon, supports the rebels in Yemen, its arming and advising the Assad regime in Syria. The reportedly Iranians tried to kill the Saudi ambassador to the US. Attacks on Israel diplomats in India and Georgia. The list goes on. This is the background that the American debate takes place in. This background, this sense of an active adversary, a country which is actively engaged in killing Americans, and that's the phrase that you see repeatedly in American debate, explains the context in which the desire, or the apparent desire, of Iran to get the bomb is judged. This comes on to sort of the bigger question. Well, why does Iran want the bomb, and therefore, what level of problem does it pose as a consequence? I know Stefan touches on this, but I want to look at it a bit more detail. There's 7 possibilities as to why Iran would want to get the bomb, and where you actually locate that desire for the bomb gives you a degree of how you judge the problem. First of all, it could be it's a simple existential deterrence, the idea of trying to protect Iran from an attack from outside power, most obviously the United States. But of course, historically, Iran's enemy in the region was Iraq, and Iraq's inflicted huge damage in the Iran-Iraq war on Iran, unprecedented degree of damage and death actually in that war. So you essentially understand the desire for an existential deterrence of that sort. If it was that wouldn't most people be a problem. But then, as you go on, though, the other issues follow from that. There might be a second level of extended deterrence, whereby, in the same way that America extended nuclear umbrella to other countries, Iran could do the same thing to Syria or to other players in the region. Thirdly, it might use its nuclear status to blackmail or intimidate other states and demand certain things. Fourthly, it could engage in more aggressive behaviour on the assumption that it was now immune from retaliation. And that, of course, is a major concern. Fifthly, Iran might seek to spread its capability to allies, perhaps viewing its technological achievement as an Islamic bomb or possibly even a Shia bomb. Sixthly, and much more seriously, would be the prospect that Iran would spread its bomb to terrorist groups in the Middle East or wider. And seventhly, lastly, Iran could in theory get set or actually use nuclear weapons to attack its perceived enemies, perhaps to operationalise Ahmadinejad's alleged threat to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. Now, those are fairly extreme, some of those things, but that's the way in which the debate is judged. These are the scenarios that are painted as to what could possibly happen as a consequence of a nuclear-armed Iran in the region. Other considerations are by and large largely dismissed in large parts of the debate. The prestige, regional posturing aspect, the fact that actually nuclear weapons are domestically very popular in Iran, or even as a way to keep the oil price high. The fact that Iran has been pursuing policies that it has done has meant that there's caused an international oil market, and actually, as a consequence, Iran's sale of oil has produced more revenue than it would otherwise have done. And of course, it may also be argued that keeping the focus on this in the same way that Asaf talked about Israel, therefore deflecting attention away from the Palestinian issue, Iran deflected attention away from its activities, its subversion activities elsewhere. There's even suggestion, one thing I read yesterday that talks about actually maybe Iran would want us to split Israel from the West by provoking an attack on it from Israel. So the whole variety of scenarios talked about there as possible ways in which the motivation for Iran's nuclear program might actually affect the region in a variety of ways. The options that follow from this are widely trailed in the press, and the military ones, as I'm sure people talk about, are not great. The options are limited in terms of actually the nuclear facilities Iran has learned from the attack of Osirak in '81. So the Iranian facilities are hardened, buried, dispersed, concealed, duplicated, and co-located, and therefore it makes it very difficult to actually dig them out and then attack. And there are no good options for attacking the nuclear facilities in Iran. You wouldn't destroy them, you set them back. You might trigger a wider war. You'd increase the oil price, disrupt the world economy, increase support for nuclear weapons in Iran, and actually make a very dangerous injured snake rather than cut the head off the snake, as Saudi Arabia has argued. So what we see instead is a whole variety of coercive diplomacy strategies. And what you can describe the US policy now is classic Alexander George's gradual turning of the screw. We've gone from open-hand diplomacy to increasingly sanctions policy, disinvestment, while at the same time as engagement, and at the same time ultimately military threats coming as part of that ultimate program. Israel's approach has been more consistently simultaneous subversion, sanctions, and military preparation and threats. There's almost a degree to which there is a good cop, bad cop dimension to the policy, where Israel gives the impression, rather like in the chicken game, of actually being a potentially reckless player in this to try and ratchet up the pressure on Iran, whereas America is good cop, say you better deal with us, you better negotiate, rather than have this policy. The military threats, of course, are there to heighten the pressure on other states to follow the sanctions policy, to pressure suppliers of Iran, and generally to actually suggest that something needs to be done is imminent, and to make it actually an issue of concern that needs to be dealt with now rather than something to be put off later. They're the strategy in terms of the coercion, but actually, what does America want? And this is interesting because this has changed. If you look at a statement by George Bush back in 2006, he said, the Iranians should not have a nuclear weapon, the capacity to have a nuclear weapon, or the knowledge as to how to make a nuclear weapon. Well, that's a big ask. And actually, Obama's walked back from that quite a way. He said, we will not allow Iran to get a nuclear weapon. But what does that mean? Not allow. What does get mean? What does nuclear weapon mean, in a sense, actually, because these things are important. And again, I've got a typology here of actually 10 phases of this. The first 3 stages, interestingly, in terms of the process towards nuclear facilitation, acquisition, have been reached. The first stage is being crossed with the stated desire to break out of the International Atomic Energy Agency's safeguards. The second is to move towards the enrichment of uranium. The third would be building and equipping facilities to enrich uranium on an industrial scale. And the fourth is doing this in a way that was impossible to destroy with conventional strike, the so-called zone of immunity that the Israelis talk about. The fifth would be, what would come next, would be giving notice to leave the non-proliferation treaty perhaps, announcing the existence of a nuclear weapon, the announcement or detection of a nuclear weapon test, the marrying of a nuclear device to a delivery system, weaponization, and 10th, the operational deployment of such a system, and then 11, you can argue actually the acquisition of target data to actually to use those things. Now, there's a series of steps, a series of thresholds, a series of points at which, lines at which could be crossed. And you can argue actually that only the last two would justify a nuclear weapon, a nuclear attack on the nuclear weapon systems, and the lower ones wouldn't and could be tolerated. But all the American diplomacy is designed to create ambiguity as to what point at which the Americans would respond. To try and actually stop them at as low a level as possible, to actually coerce them to say, okay, we don't know what would be tolerable, and therefore we better stop here. But in doing so, you create a climate of anxiety and of threat, which actually brings the threshold further down than it need necessarily be. And that's the danger of this sort of gamesmanship, this brinkmanship that we're in the process of doing. What I'd argue, actually, that where that red line is I say, change for Obama. But now I'd argue, actually, that there is a red line somewhere there. I think, actually, the Americans would not tolerate a deployed Iranian nuclear weapon. And I think we're miles away from that, as Scott argued. But actually, there's still a possibility in constructing the threats against Iran that actually by virtue of concerns about credibility, by concerns about timetables, and particularly the progress of actually enriching uranium, that you actually create a crisis whereby, as a consequence of inadvertence, you end up being pushed down a road towards war. And I think actually, for those who think this is not very likely, I think it's very likely, I think it's possible, but we should look at the example of 2003, where actually we had a war, a major war, over phony WMD, and there's a possibility that actually, in thinking about these strategies, we end up in the same situation again.
Thank you very much, David. Let's move on to Peter Gray from War Studies, who will be talking about the effectiveness of Airpower against Iran.
Thank you, Asaf, and thank you very much for the kind invitation to come over to talk on the effectiveness or otherwise of Airpower. By way of very, very brief introduction, I spent 37 years or so in the Royal Air Force, so come with a little bit of baggage from that area, and I admit that openly. I'd throw into the equation on top of that 3 years in the Cabinet Office and a fair amount of time on the other side of Whitehall looking at strategic planning, contingencies, scenarios and so forth. And I'll bring that into the debate. I'm going to have to, because if I listen to Scott, I don't need to go any further because there's no target. So Airpower just doesn't need to bother. If I listen to David, there are no military options. We can't dig them out. If I read The Economist and I have a look at the quality of Iranian civil engineering and the sorts of concrete that they are developing, makes the German regime in 1939 to 1945 amateurs in building concrete structures. So should I really go any further? One of the other things that we need to look at is the wider context on the military effectiveness side. And what I'd invite you, first of all, to have a think back in recent history to, and that's the Israel raid on the Iraq reactors. Very, very effective in its own way. Is that repeatable, or have people learned the lessons? Probably they've learned the lessons. But equally, when you look at the scale of what has been happening, both with the cyber attacks, the Stuxnet, and so forth, probably plus or minus other things that we don't know about. Add to that the assassinations and stuff. Some people are taking this argument pretty seriously. And I think in that context, we might as well spend 5 minutes, again, taking it seriously. That brings me back to the title I've been asked to talk to, the effectiveness of Airpower. To which I pose a separate question, and that is, what effect do you want air power to have? What actually do you want to do? Let me, before I go into that, let me just say a couple of words on why would we want to do it? And looking back over the use of air power since the end of the Cold War, there are various reasons, various things that we can actually draw from that. The first of all is the very regrettable answer, because we can. And there have been a number of uses of air power, arguably from El Dorado Canyon, the bombing of Libya, Reagan-Thatcher alliance, through the Balkans, through into Libya, and certainly the two Gulf Wars, where air power has been used because we can. And for better or worse, when it comes to military planning and military advice to politicians, we can do this. So, regrettable as it sounds, that is something real that we mustn't discount. There's the element which we've been hearing about because we should. There's the element of because somebody else might do it. If we take Israel and the United States acting pretty much together, that becomes less of an argument, but it's still sitting there. And finally, and especially to Stefan's answer to my question of who else might be involved, there can be a possibly railway timetable, possibly chaos theory. It might just end up as the only solution at the time. Brings me back to my first comment, and there'll be plenty of people that will be saying, because we can. The instant answer to what effect are we trying to have, well, we'll try and dig them out. We'll try and destroy the capability. We'll try and destroy the... to my mind, we're focusing on the wrong word in that. The word destroy is not necessarily the only word in the air power lexicon. And what I'd ask you to look at, if I had all day to do this presentation, I put up a series of aerial photographs of where the sites are in Iran, and I would compare and contrast that to some of the sites where the Germans were assembling V2 weapons in northern France. So Matterpole, Epelec, the various hugely hardened bunkers. Did the combined bombing offensive, did the Royal Air Force, even with tall boys and grand slams, did they destroy them? No. Did that mean that the raids were ineffective? Not at all. Because when you look at those aerial photographs, it looks like a moonscape. Various rocket parts that were supposed to come in by train, no trains were going to run there. Worse than the underground on a Sunday in London. Nothing was running. And my suggestion to you that if you want to deny the capability, you can certainly deny the capability of getting stuff in there, getting stuff out of there. You try and work on the basis, if you're an Iranian planner, that you put them somewhere remote. Well, that just makes you even more vulnerable to the effectiveness of a limited transportation type strike. What else might you be trying to do? So, destruction, probably not. Access and denial, yes, you can probably do that. Relatively easily, relatively inexpensively, and that leads on to the third thing that you could probably do, and that is a degree of coercion, a degree of turning it into a place where you wouldn't particularly want to turn up to work. If you've actually hit the top of these things, how much leakage is there? Would you really want to be going to find out? How do you get the plant back in operation? Or, as David suggested, do you go to a different one? Is it going to be a greater dirty threat? Only the Iranians know that. But you could get a fair idea from intelligence sources, by whatever means, as to just how effective you'd been in that. And the other area that is not normally covered in the conjecture on the use of air power in these things is a wider targeting. And if you start looking at areas around the nuclear program, around the energy program, or for that matter around the military, where else could you choose to target a single air tasking order, a single overnight campaign? Could you go for military communications? Could you go for, just as a demonstration, surface-to-air missiles and C2 sites? Some of the things that we saw in the lead-up to 2003. And if you were to match the air power targeting in 2002 in the guise of the no-fly zones, you could actually start coming up with an effective, very short air campaign without even attempting to destroy. In all of these things, there are issues and there are problems. One of the direct effects of targeting the V2 systems in northern France was the movement of all of the slave labour to underground camps and appalling conditions, death, misery, slavery, and so forth. Unintended consequences. What else will be the result of air power and its effectiveness? And I have to say, ladies and gentlemen, that the answer to that question is not particularly reassuring, because the air power planners alone aren't very good at building that into their calculations.
Thank you very much, Peter. Our final speaker on this session is a very own rising star of the college, Adam Quinn. Give me a five later. He will be talking about the domestic situation in the US and the forthcoming presidential elections and their impact, and vice versa on the Iran situation.
Thank you very much, Asaf, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. Have opinions, will travel is my slogan, and only coming downstairs is especially fine. It's also a special pleasure to be here for the first event of the Institute for Conflict, Cooperation and Security. Thanks very much to Nick for all the efforts that he's put into that in general and this event. I look forward to being involved in many good events over the course of the years to come under that umbrella. What I'm here to talk to you about in 10 minutes, that's my mission, and I endeavour to meet it, is the relationship of this issue to the US presidential election. What I interpret that to mean, I guess, is two things, really. The connection to the US presidential election in the sense that you have a president, someone else wants to be the president. What, substantively speaking, is the difference, if any, on this particular issue? So therefore, does the result of the election, the possibility of US leadership change, make a difference? Second point is, what importance does the fact of the election itself, which is to say the fact that the United States is going to be in a state of campaigning over who gets to lead the country, in which this is one of the issues that may be debated, what effect will the existence of the election per se have on the possibility of dealing with this issue? On the former point, you may have noticed, to the extent that foreign policy has come up at all in the course of the election so far, Iran was one of the issues that was mentioned most prominently by the Republican field during the primaries, and some of them were quite striking for the bellicosity of the tone of the comments that they made. People like Rick Santorum, people like Newt Gingrich, who made a surge towards the possibility of gaining the nomination about halfway through the process and has since faded. The Republican Party, at least over the last 20 years, it would be a bit presentist to say this has always been the case, but over the last 20, 25 years, has certainly staked out a space for itself as the party of hawkish views and the party of intervention and the party of military solutions offered to diplomatic problems, much more in contrast to the Democratic Party. And that's the way its base has by and large now been socialised into understanding these issues. So with the striking exception of Ron Paul, a kind of perennial anti-war, anti-military industrial complex candidate who they have had in their primaries, all of their candidates' main role in foreign policy in the primaries has basically been to try and out-hawk one another over the course of this debate, to the point where the president actually made a public statement basically criticising these guys for talking irresponsibly about something that could have real-world consequences at one point when Santorum was getting particularly shrill in his comments. We now do have a nominee. Newt Gingrich doesn't seem to know it yet, but we do have a nominee in the form of Mitt Romney, the former governor of Massachusetts, who is the moderate candidate in so much as that means anything within the context of the modern Republican Party. And it seems fairly clear that his goal over the course of this election campaign will be essentially to attack Obama as a weak president in foreign policy in general, and with this being one of the issues on which you attempt to do that. His own particular phrase on his campaign website, taken from a speech, is one thing you can know, one thing we can know. We're going to talk about the American electorate as we, or one of them. One thing we can know is that if we re-elect Barack Obama, Iran will have a nuclear weapon. And if we elect Mitt Romney, me, then Iran will not have a nuclear weapon. This is what the guy says, and he says it not by accident, but in such a way as to want to put it on his website as representative of his point of view. What does he think we should be doing? We, in this case, being the US government, he thinks that essentially the United States should talk a lot more about the possibility of using a military option. He thinks that Barack Obama has played that down too much, that making it more explicit that it's a serious possibility will make a difference. He advocates crippling sanctions. He believes that Russia could potentially have been leveraged into supporting a tougher sanctions regime at around the same time as Obama was toning down its missile defense plans. That's entirely debatable, obviously, but it's a talking point for him, and he says that the sanctions regime could be tougher. He also makes noises about wanting to encourage dissidents within Iran, etc., the kind of regime change mode of analysis, whereby you say that the ultimate solution is to try and get rid of the Iranian government in some way, because different government, different set of political attitudes, therefore no desire to pursue the program that they're pursuing. So the stage for the election is fairly clear then. Barack Obama attempts to make himself sound like the tough but reasonable candidate, saying that he's doing all he can, indeed that he's mobilized a lot more international support behind the current regime of sanctions than his predecessors' more explicitly tough approach did, but at the same time he's trying to be circumspect in what he does because a war is not a good outcome and he wants that to be the last resort. Meanwhile, the Republican Party, with Romney as representative, hammers him for being insufficiently strong. In terms of the policy content, this obviously founders with the administration simply coming to the Republicans and saying, well, what specifically that we haven't done would you do instead? You know, how would you get these tougher sanctions when there's no mechanism to do that? How do you propose to suddenly turn a handful of dissidents into a regime overthrowing movement? You know, is it a speech from the US president on television that you think is all that's required to overthrow these people? Aside from the possibility of war, and the options for that are not great, it's not very clear what it is that these guys are saying they're more inclined to do than the than the president would do. So what I would say is that there is comparatively little scope for real substantive political change in terms of the policy at the end of the day, should the Republicans win this election and there be a Romney presidency. What will happen, if that happens, is that someone who has talked much more vocally about the need for a military option to be on the table will then be in office. And it boils down to a question of whether or not you think the frequency with which you discuss possibilities on the table means that there's more possibility of the frequency with which you discuss the military option either means that the Iranians are more likely to back down because they're more frightened of you and therefore there's going to be more likelihood that you will reach a solution, or the fact that you're talking so loudly about this will make them dig in and make it harder for you to back down and make it more likely that things will spiral out of control. But it's that kind of more finely grained difference between the implications of certain kinds of talk in terms of your leaning and options, rather than the case that one's the war candidate and the other's the peace candidate. Obama's tougher than they say he is, and Romney is not looking for a war by any means. Two bits of context that I want to put this in, I suppose. One is the public context. This is not 2003 in terms of the American public's attitude to the idea of proactively seeking war. A lot of people were prepared to be talked into the idea that war was, if not the first resort, at least an acceptable middle-ranking option back in those days. The American public has a terrible amount of buyer's remorse about what happened in Iraq. It's already telling pollsters again and again and again that they should cut Afghanistan loose, regardless of the consequences. This is not worth the resources being devoted to it. So you're dealing with an electorate that is not at all whetted in its appetite for a large-scale military operation. That therefore means that although you can rely on a certain rally round the flag effect in the immediate period after any military operation breaks out, no candidate is especially keen to become associated, should any conflict break out, with having proactively sought it or having regarded it as something. It's not the kind of thing that people are likely to want to put on campaign buttons as an outcome that would likely result from their policy. The opposition stance here is basically that by simply talking tougher, you can obtain your maximal solution without the need to actually go through with it. By threatening war, you get the consequences that you want without the need to actually follow through. Now, you don't need me to list off the historical precedents for the idea that this may be a rather dangerous way to go down. Once you've put yourself on the line, of course, then the logic becomes, well, obviously we don't think war's a good idea, but our honour now demands it, so we have to follow through in spite of all sense and reason. So it's a dangerous game. But that's the talk that's the oppositional stance. It's the luxury of opposition, of course, to be able to say things like that. Barack Obama can't, because anything he says has consequences because it's coming out of the mouth of the president. People will expect it to be backed up. The second context that I want to put this in briefly is in terms of effect on the behaviour of others in two cases. First of all, the possibility of an effect on the behaviour of Israel. Israel, as we've mentioned, sees itself as having a closing military window to some extent. The United States has a set of military capabilities that give it a far longer time frame within which it can potentially knock out this program. The Israelis see themselves as having a smaller period when they can do it without US help, therefore they're seeing a strike as more urgent. There is also, arguably, however, more importantly from my point of view, a closing political window from their point of view. Barack Obama is not a president they see as particularly sympathetic. He is clearly a president that they see as being potentially willing to allow Iran to get something more in the way of a capability that they're comfortable of, which as the price of a deal. If they therefore see him as likely to be re-elected, they have a window of time prior to that election when he's unusually vulnerable to public pressure in which to launch this assault of theirs should they be planning. Their hope will therefore presumably be that while he's so close to an election, he will be subjected through themselves and through AIPAC and through a variety of noisy public mechanisms they have into a very difficult position where he has to decide whether or not to be bounced into supporting Israel in the white heat of a public crisis in a way that he would not be disposed to do, or which will be difficult. Now, I think that's a gamble for them. I don't think it's the foregone conclusion that they think it is. It's reminiscent to me of the Bay of Pigs, where the generals famously wanted to get Kennedy into something that couldn't possibly work as a plan based on the assumption that once it didn't, he would then just be slalomed by public opinion into going along with it. They got rather a surprise in that case. I think it's perfectly possible that Barack Obama might have more of a spine on this than he's given credit for. But to the extent that they are uncomfortable with Obama as a long-term president in terms of his support for their preferred outcomes here, the period before his election is a crucial window, and the more confident they become he's going to win, the more likelihood there might be that they will, however ill-advisedly, do something to take account of that fact. Second point, just finally to finish up, is the other context is to do with Iran, which is a kind of flip side of that in a way. This is probably less of a strong consideration in terms of the weight of their basket, I would suggest, but nevertheless it's a possibility. If the Iranians feel like sanctions are starting to bite, and if they see Barack Obama as being willing to compromise, which I think he's gone out of his way to demonstrate in some ways that he is within certain confines, then perhaps the window of time when they're certain he's in office is the window of time to seek some kind of deal with the American administration. If his replacement's going to be someone who's just travelled the length of the country explaining that nothing but the maximal solution is acceptable and the war is your tool for achieving that, then maybe this is the moment in which they can seek to reach out. Of course, Barack Obama, ironically, is in a worse position to accept a deal before the election than he would be after it, so the imperatives cut against each other. Now, I think, looking at the kind of domestic imperatives that the Republicans are dealing, or that the Iranians are dealing with, looking at the broader basket of international pressures, I think this is a smaller part of their calculations, perhaps, than it is for the Israelis. But I can certainly see that if they're worried the Republicans are going to win, and if they do want some sort of deal, then there would be a certain logic to getting serious about it now, rather than getting serious about it in time. So, for final sentence, I would just say that a Republican victory probably wouldn't help, but more substantively, what is not helping probably is the presence of this election campaign at this particular moment. Although the difficulty of trying to run a foreign policy in a democratic country is something that people have been complaining about since George Kennan. So I'm not the first to point out that democracy can be unhelpful when you're trying to get a strategy on the road. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adam.